ourselves into session here, and we're continuing with our workshop model discussion of the program environmental impact report on the vegetation treatment program for the state. And we do have additional footage being filmed for the Humboldt Access. This is your public access channel, I believe. And so if our voices drop down because we're being too contemplative, we may get a hand in the air which says, could you speak up just a little bit for the mic? So, I hope you had time between our last treatment on this. Last time, if you remember, we focused on higher level comments that we'd received about program scope and objectives. And we sort of went through that category. I know this time around I spent most of my attention, most intently, I was looking at the questions about the CEQA tiering, and we actually got some guidance about that. And so I think I'd like to start with that, but I think we really, I'm interested in people bringing up the comments as we move kind of systematically through here that you feel really need the board's attention to address them, to decide whether or not we're happy with what's in here or whether we feel we need in some places to augment the document that's before us. And I'll just start this discussion about the CEQA tiering with an acknowledgement that I am a forester and I am an economist. I am not a lawyer. So that's one reason I spent the most time looking at this. And I found we had a great number of comments on the issue of the CEQA tiering. And to my mind, they're not all identical. Some of them had interesting different elements in them as I was reading them, but there was sort of a common thread, which was a criticism that the PEIR was not detailed enough as a first level. That, here, let me get to the best summary of that issue. Basically, that it was not detailed enough, that relying on assessment of environmental impacts, it was too heavily setting in motion a process in which environmental impacts could only be analyzed at the project level, and so you could not address that reliance on project level analysis meant that the analysis at the PEIR level was inherently inadequate.
Due to lack of sufficient detail.
Due to lack of sufficient detail. That the monitoring of the cumulative impacts at the project level was ineffective or unenforceable, so that there was not an adequate feedback loop there. And that there was sort of insubstantial foundation laid in terms of the scientific background for statements made. So does that feel like a summary, or would anyone like to edit my sort of high-level non-lawyer summary of those CEQA tiering comments?
Well, I think the only other key point that a lot of these made was that the variety of different vegetation types and fire regimes throughout the state was one of the reasons why the projects couldn't be analyzed at a statewide level. Would you agree, or, I mean, a lot of the comments
I
talk
put
about
that as a nuance under, there just
nuance.
isn't enough detail, that it's a complex state, and
Particularly on the
but yeah.
biological
right.
setting.
And I
is
think
what I called from it.
yeah, and as you get down a little deeper, and I think that's a fair one to say. And I think this is one of those general, so the whole set that we've labeled as Vtpeir. It strikes me as I feel like I'm watching different earlier parts of my career play out again. I've seen this sort of tension before in any multi-level analysis, and if you look at the way the U.S. Forest Service tried to implement planning after the National Forest Management Act, and also be in compliance with the Resource Planning Act, and with the guidelines that led to the EPA, whenever you have a multi-level sort of analysis, you can criticize that the detail is inappropriately situated at the different levels of the analysis. So what level of analysis is appropriate in a forest plan versus a regional plan versus a national plan versus a project? Frequently any planning process like this is subjected to legal challenge on the basis that the detail is inadequate or it's situated at the wrong level. There is a criticism, I think, in this case, that without the detail, the public has no right to weigh, or has no avenue to weigh in. And that's the criticism of why all of the detail needs to be at this level in this document, which is before the public right now. That was the criticism I found the easiest in my mind to say I don't accept that criticism. That I think there are actually 4 levels, at least, of analysis here, if not more. Just under the state agency framework, there's a state-level fire plan. There's the potential for PEIR, for some program element that fits in under the fire plan. There are the unit plans, where all of these projects have to be identified and vetted through a unit planning exercise, the way this document is structured. And then there's the actual project review level, where anything that's involving fuel breaks or ecological restoration, where there is the most divergence, I think, in the effectiveness and scientific justification in the literature as to the right way to do this. Those have to be dealt with in a public forum, in addition to whatever kind of public forum you have community input into in development of a unit plan, which is frequently got a lot of public input, especially when you're tying together unit planning with community wildfire protection planning, as the federal government encourages us to do. So it's a judgment call as to whether the detail here is the right level of detail on our part. We can't make a legal determination of adequacy of the detail, but I think we've all read this document carefully. I know everyone on the board has struggled through the document despite its length. I know Member Husari has gone through it practically at the comma levels in particular. But I'm not sure that the criticism of insufficient detail that's been levied at the plan at this point is remediable, in the sense that I don't feel there is a level of detail that could be incorporated in the absence of projects which could increase the foundation for this. And I think that So I don't feel. It's as though if this level of detail is not adequate, then what you're really calling into question is whether or not a PEIR is a useful model for the state to pursue for the vegetation treatment program. I personally believe it is, in part because of one of the criticisms that's levied about detail and the capacity to gather detail at the local level, that I think a higher level analysis like this of the foundations for the different treatment mechanisms that we're employing, I think it has been done better at a high level than it would be done in the context of people moving in and out of vegetation treatment program coordinator kind of positions at a local level. So we've employed a higher level of talent to review a bunch of these issues. I think it provides, the PEIR would provide a good foundation that wouldn't remove the obligation at the local level to seriously consider the local dimensions, especially on an ecological basis. But I think the balance feels right to me for what is achievable, while trying to set up a process that sets up the local unit level planning for success. So I do feel it's a useful framework, despite the difficulty of coming with that right balance between what procedures and foundation do you establish at the different levels in the planning process. And so I can't say that I find that general sort of, I believe, sort of 5 fundamental criticisms of the sequentiering relative to this document. I can't say that I find it a compelling criticism. And I'm not sure that the criticism as it is levied is one which can be addressed in a way where we can say, there, we nailed that one. I feel like this is really a decision point for the board as to whether or not it feels there's additional detail that can be added that addresses that criticism that can actually go into a document like this. And so with that, I'll open it up for board comment. But those were my ruminations on this as I was trying to get ready for this workshop. So, board members. Member Husari.
Well, I think that the one of the strong points of the document is that it does subject every project to a consistent set of evaluation factors at the local level, and that consistency is quite rigorous, and it does allow us to look at each project the same way, and that's one of its very strong points, that although by necessity the broad look is pretty generalized, it does cause the agency and the public and the landowners to look at every project the same way because of how detailed the project level requirements are, and that is how the team, I think, sought to give the whole to deal with the level of variability that occurs in a place as big and variable as California is.
Others?
I would say I basically agree. I've come to the same conclusion that this provides a very useful framework for being able to look at projects across a variety of environments in a uniform way with uniform objectives, and in the context of other policy statements, for example, the strategic fire plan, so it's cohesive in that regard. and it also provides for a uniform means of tracking progress in this policy issue. How are we doing? Rather than have projects spread out through 20 various units across the state. So I do think that there is only a certain amount of detail that you can get into with examining every potential adverse effect or cumulative effect over the entire range of bioregions. And so I think the framework of this has provided adequate opportunity to make that analysis a defensible analysis on a local basis. So.
Member Farber.
Yeah. So what I did is to kind of wrap my head around this a little better, I took Ida's homework assignment of just reading the program EIR kind of law. And kind of what I came back to is that, much like Member Usari said, is that we are providing a consistent evaluation, I think is really, and it's not just a checklist, but it's an evaluation that then can employ specific measures, which we have documented by task. That, I think, then links to making a cohesive kind of evaluation of the potential impacts of the program. Without having those standard measures in there, there'd be just too wide a range of potential outcomes, I think. I think the only concern I had, and I believe it came from Department of Fish and Wildlife when I think it was in their comment letter, they're saying, well, there may or may not be staff available to work on some of these projects. This doesn't create staff level or anything.
Yeah.
Because I know when we were early on working through this, that's one of the key points of the structure is that, that the project proponent and the units are going to go to the local agencies. Hey, do you have any additional comments? Do you have any additional information? And we're hoping that those agencies are going to see these as viable projects and important enough for the environment that they're going to participate. That's so I'm not quite sure how to take that letter from the department on that one. That was my only pause because in the environment, there are going to be some site-specific things that you couldn't have possibly gotten in those specific measures. That it would be helpful to work with the local agencies, especially when you have maybe a teeny species or something like that.
Yeah, my reaction to that was there may be first off, the level of activity here that's envisioned is not a dramatic expansion.
Yeah.
And if it were a dramatic expansion, some of my feelings about some of the comments about the adequacy of analysis, especially with respect to whether or not you could have laid a foundation for no significant impact, might be different. But it is kind of within a realm of observable scale of activity in the past, where at least you would say by revealed evidence, do we have evidence of, if you make a statement that this level of activity would result in significant deleterious impacts, you would say, then that is a statement that our current activity is resulting in significant deleterious impacts because this is not very much out of the range of normal for the program activity here. But that same consideration would apply to workforce adequacy, and it's not actually our board's it's not in our portfolio to analyze the capacity of agencies to respond to their mandates like that outside of CAL FIRE.
And I didn't view it as
it's an interesting observation.
It's
that they made
actionable item or something we could address.
But getting into the budgetary allocations that the legislature makes in response to competing demands for activities by agencies, it's sort of
But
the scale felt wrong for me to treat that as a major issue.
Yeah, no, that's why I kind of just brought it up as a sidelight to this. Otherwise, I thought it was a good list of measures. But one of the key things is we need to have working together with other departments. I mean, and hopefully everybody recognizes that. And that, I would actually like to see that in the response as maybe an encouragement to Department of Fish and Wildlife and the individual regional water quality control boards, is that when they're asked to participate in these, we would hope they would step forward and participate in these kind of projects, because the hope is that they're providing long-term benefit to the environment that should benefit the resources they're entrusted with, whether it be water quality or wildlife or something like that. So I didn't see it as necessarily a change, but it seems like an opportunity to encourage those departments to make it an even better process than it has been in the past. Participation is we'd like to, and I know, this goes back a few years, but the most to the point comment along these lines that we had in these tours was when we were down in Ventura, and in that unit, at that time, I think it was the VMP forester at the time, he was crying out for help. Not only help from this document that this will provide him, because it'll provide the structure and consistent evaluation, but just help from other agencies too. They weren't ignoring the other agencies. They were looking for kind of participation. And so I think this is maybe somewhere in our responses, it'd be nice to encourage the other departments to fulfill, I guess, as you put it, their obligations.
Right. And whether that's resource augmentation or reallocation of resources within agencies is actually not the purview of this board.
No, that's why kind of an encouragement.
Yeah. I do think it's a priority, and so whether you're in a resource growth or resource constrained environment could require different responses by the agencies. But again, that's sort of beyond our scope here. Right. So, Member Hussar.
Doesn't Member Andre have a comment?
I'm sorry, Member Andre, were you?
Oh, yeah. Sure, I'll say a few things, I think. In general, I think the word cohesive is one that I was going to hit on, too, because it's about providing that cohesive framework for kind of even evaluation and treatment of projects. I just had a question, though, on the... Didn't earlier versions have a little more detail on the biological setting, maybe from BRAP, whatever you use in WHR? Did that kind of scale back to vegetation typing? I couldn't find my earlier versions, but that was a question.
Well, there was the response to the Fire Science Consortium's review about the focusing on the three vegetation types, so maybe that's the switch you're observing.
It seemed like it maybe narrowed things, and that's when I think a lot of comments kind of generated from that.
Yeah,
so
I think the review they did indicated that they felt it would be a more effective document and more transparent to the public if they focused on that kind of framing. So there was a change.
And that change, I think we lost some of that detail that we're now getting the comments about. But so I didn't have a chance to go back to compare and contrast. But it was an observation.
Yeah. I felt it was more of a repackaging analysis rather than a lot of lost analysis. But it was, but I suppose if you're narrowing the categorization, you might have a reaction. Sorry.
Well, we were talking about capacity a minute ago relative to the partner agencies. There are comments about the question whether California has the capacity to do this work. Like there's one on page.
I know exactly the one you mean. Yeah.
And I think that in answer to that, it's an open question. does CAL FIRE have sufficient staff? I think the answer to that is that if CAL FIRE does not have sufficient staff, the projects
Don't happen.
wouldn't be done.
Right.
And because all of these steps are required, there's no opt-out if CAL FIRE doesn't have sufficient staff. So I think, as we address that issue, I think that is the way I would answer that. I'm not sure about the rest of the board, but that's true of the participation of other agencies as well, is in absence of sufficient capacity to do the work, then that project wouldn't be done. I don't think it would. The tone of some of the comments is that it seems to imply that we would go ahead and do the projects anyway. But that's not the case. The projects won't be done without, at least to me as a board member, the projects wouldn't be done unless the required work was going to be completed.
Right. In fact, if you didn't have the staffing at the program level, there's 3 stages of internal review here. And I would suspect it just dies at the first level. It doesn't get to the regional or the programmatic state
to the
level.
To the I don't know whether the team wants to add to that or not. Team members.
Yeah, I think we're pretty explicit in all the different steps that need to be completed to have a viable project. And so my assumption, and I'm guessing the rest of the team's assumption, is that if those required steps aren't taken, we wouldn't have a project.
Under the VTP.
Under the VTP.
So there is a program. We're assuming there's a program that the environmental programmatic EIR will help facilitate. But in the absence of budget in the future for the program itself or for that other agency involvement, it's hard for this EIR to address that kind of stuff. Really, it's not the purview, I don't think, of the environmental document necessarily.
Other comments on this issue?
I'm working on it.
Okay. I have a couple more comments, so I'll throw a couple of those out on the tiering issue while you're working on that one. There's also a pervasive thread beyond that general criticism that the scope of the envisioned activities is no excuse for a lack of specificity. So I'm not moved by the lack of detail criticism, to be frank, given the tiering of the documents and what analysis has been done. But with respect to whether or not the program team that prepared this has come to a correct assessment that in most cases there aren't significant environmental impacts, but air quality was the one area where they said they needed special program review. The scope of the envisioned activities does matter materially on that. And so saying you need more analysis to be able to say this, well, in fact, the fact that this is a very modest scope in terms of activities matters, I think, very material as to whether I view this as having laid an adequate foundation for that determination of the significant impacts. And so anybody else want to weigh in on that one? That was just my impression as I was going through trying to, because that is another thread that works through 4 or 5 of these. There was one comment that basically said the procedure for the project level analysis couldn't be trusted, which implied a presumption that someone might act in bad faith at the local level, and that's not, people acting in bad faith is not something that we're going to design against. The cumulative impacts.
One other addition to that.
Sure.
It may be out of lack of knowledge, I think, is another implied. Doesn't necessarily have to be nefarious. It could be a lack of local
Yes,
knowledge.
that's right.
And not having that project in a public forum that may exclude people that may have specific local knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I just...
If you're ready, anytime now.
I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm going to pop it in anyway.
Oh, give it a shot.
Yeah. So you said something about that is, I think, capturing part of where I'm coming from on this. With the sort of the air quality thing, that's sort of a special category.
Yes.
And when I read the comments, I'm thinking that it's the plant community people that are most vocal around a lot of these issues.
Yes.
And maybe we need to privilege the vegetation sciences in a way like the air quality. But I haven't figured out how to do that yet. And I don't want to give them CNPS listing carte blanche that gets railroad everything, because that's not a legal framework.
That's right.
But I hear the importance of vegetation for defining a lot of ecosystem services around diversity, birds, fire frequency issues, rare plants, lizards, all kinds of things. Anyway, so that's where I'm struggling in this document, is because I think that's the only place that people are really wanting more specificity. And then going back to what Susan said about the bigness of the state and almost early decisions that maybe we should split up the North and the South because of these really big vegetation differences. I don't know what to do with that yet, but that's the part that bothers me about the lack of I don't want to use the word specificity, but in some of the words they're using, foreseeable environmental impacts.
Right.
That word, because it's differential across the state in so many different ways and complicated ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to do a ecosystem by ecosystem analysis. I think that's overkill. But somehow privileging that vegetation complexity in the document in a little bit more sophisticated way, I think, would be useful. Right.
I think at the root of some of the comments which are directed at the entire PEIR, I think what you're saying, Mark, is reflected in those comments where they say this is the treatment is inadequate to reflect the ecological impacts. In reality, I think that's not so much a criticism of the entire PEIR,
I agree,
but it's a treatment of the ecological restoration dimension of this. That in fact, I think treatment mechanisms that are relatively uncontroversial in highly disrupted, highly urbanized environments become controversial in things where there is no WUI public safety infrastructure defense, immediate public health implication of air quality. And I think it's that sort of feeling that in areas where they're worried that we haven't dealt with the vegetation locally, and will things which are uncontroversial in one setting be applied broadly in ways that people find inappropriate, and that ecologically, I think there's a good faith problem going on there, right? That there are things that I can well envision us doing in an area like the Oakland Hills kind of environment that we would not do in the backcountry. So, but again, privileging particular stakeholders in the process isn't a mechanism that I think I'm comfortable with the board going down in that kind of a checklist, as you say, when we move into a a non-legal framework like that, where we privilege a stakeholder, on the other hand, is the voice that's given at the project level in the forums going to be adequate to do that? I mean, I'm a firm believer, frankly, in citizen science. I promote a lot of citizen science things through my role as dean, and I think it has a special role in the environment in cases like this because it's a massive human capital expansion by the agencies when you involve the communities. But I don't know, and I'm not sure. I haven't come up with any way to resolve that. But I tend not to say fear that people would be able to slide one by a community that's looking out for stuff that it highly values is less likely than not. So, I don't know. I don't know where to go with that remark. So, and I know you've had a lot of engagement with communities like that in a way. So if you can think of any way that we can address that, that would be useful for the board. Member Husari.
Well, I was just going to say, there are pretty specific, in terms of the plant communities that are being called out, primarily Southern California chaparral, there are pretty specific requirements at the project level that relate only to those communities. And I think particularly in terms of the requirement to have public meetings where it's not required in other cases, it's understandable why the public in that part of the state is upset, because these are ecosystems that are besieged in many ways by so many different forces, development, which leads to fragmentation of systems that were not widely distributed to begin with because of just the nature of Southern California. So it's understandable, and I think the challenge is really at the local level for the units to engage more openly and regularly with the communities of concern as the program develops, because because of lack of engagement of that type, or my perception of it, that's a lot of why the concern has developed as we develop something on a programmatic scale.
Yeah, I think that fear is well embodied in the next set of comments on program effectiveness, where people are putting forward using herbicides or high-frequency fire to clear large areas of chaparral is not an appropriate mechanism, and I think everyone on the board would agree. Yes, that's absolutely true, but I'm not sure that I feel this document enables that activity in any sense. So.
Well, because of...
But the fear is there.
The fear is there, and a lot of it has to do with the way that we protect biodiversity tends to be on the species level, and the concern with a lot of these systems has to do with protecting assemblages.
Right.
And as a society, we have not chosen to provide those protections, but the scientific community has done a pretty good job in the last. It's been brought up to us by other agencies too, of identifying highly impacted and endangered assemblages of, even though the individual plants within them may not have any kind of status as sensitive or endangered.
Right. Or being compliant with the ESA in ways that really recognize that certainly both the public and the scientific community understands that assemblages
that's what it is.
Are what our
What
real
you-
societal value at its
Yeah,
core
what you walk,
is.
walk through,
Right,
what
that
you
it's-
see,
that
what,
Right.
makes up our wildlands
Right.
and the few open areas that are left, a lot of them are in public hands in that area and are, contain some of the last
Yeah.
examples.
So, is there anything else on the tiering? I think we have to decide if we've got any instructions. I mean, back to the team on this, but I don't feel I don't even feel that the treatment in here of what we might actually do in the certain chaparral types is actually structured in a way that it enables the worst case scenario that we don't want here, and that people's comments really show their value. They place it, as you say, this member Husari, in those assemblages. I tried to look back on that specific point and say, is there a way I could alter this document that would improve the perceived protection that we're placing there, that we're not going down a certain path? And I didn't actually feel that the treatment in the document, read on its own basis as opposed to coming to the document with a fear, knowing this is what I don't want, right? I didn't feel that the document itself really either enabled or, to be honest, reinforced that fear that people would engage in inappropriate kinds of obsession with risk reduction to the exclusion of ecological objectives.
So maybe this may not be useful, but my perception is that fear is that when the projects come forward, the problem definition's already been defined as a fire risk problem, and it's already on the train tracks going that direction, and it's almost impossible to stop that momentum. You go to public meetings, you say, this is a really bad idea, there's my favorite little plant here that's endangered, and you're 1 in 30 people, the other 29 are the homeowners that don't want their houses to burn down, and it just feels like you're already lost, right? So because the way the projects are defined around risk, it defines the problem in a way that the Native Plant Society or other people that are thinking around vegetation as a rare resource are already feeling like they're laid down. I don't know how to fix that, because that's the whole point of the VTS.
Is that maybe an issue of reframing ecological restoration from how we have it described?
Well, there is.
I mean, if you go back to the fundamental description there, which is why I said, going back through this, thinking about what people's fears are, it says the majority of the projects approved under this would be in the WUI. And we've described at the highest level the WUI designated areas. I'm sorry, I'm looking at E3. So this is right in the objective summary, which was kind of improved over time. And it's very short. It generally consists of fuel reduction to prevent spread of fire between wildlands and structures and vice versa. And so the WUI treatments, you're right, they are cast right in our document as these are risk reduction, right? But the parallel definition for ecological restoration is outside the WUI, in areas that have departed from the natural fire regime as a result of exclusion. Ecological restoration treatments will focus on restoring ecosystem resilience by moderating uncharacteristic wildland fuel conditions to reflect historic vegetative composition and structure, including cultural landscapes. And so, to me, that's actually a very powerful statement that if I were walking into a public meeting and I said, you don't need to take the fuel loading in this area down to something extremely light, And you can't justify that as an ecological restoration project. You can't, so the things which you would justify in a WUI setting under this program, our very definition of the project would sort of exclude the risk reduction as the objective of the program. So that's why I felt going through here, I feel the fear is legitimate that we will inappropriately use the tools given what we as a society value, because we know we value safety, but we value the ecological services and settings and the resilience of our environment. But I don't feel the document is the problem here in the way that's worded. I actually felt that was a reflection of my own values as an environmentalist. I would go into an area that I felt had gone wrong in some objectively scientific basis. The species mix was changing. There was something I could do to control invasives by restoring a naturozine. So the fact that so many comments feel that fear, I mean,
yes.
We can't ignore it. There's obviously a very pervasive feeling about this document out there, but I'm not sure it's grounded in the words of the document.
Well, it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated. It is true that very few projects in Chaparral will meet the test for ecological restoration, because not only, because the projects have to pass the test of where the chaparral is old enough that it's been, is it 2 or 3 fire cycles? 3 fire cycles,
3.
which we defined as 60 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
There's a few areas in Southern California and Central California that haven't burned in that long because of they're in skips within existing fires, north slopes.
Mm-hmm.
Or there are areas of chaparral that have been surrounded by ranching and grazing and have not had an internal ignition. The number of places, and I think that's the fear, the number of places that meet that test are very limited. And so it's very concerning that there would be treatment in those areas. So the focus has to be on restoration, which is expensive and can't really be done with mechanical. In general, requires reintroduction of species and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
As it's written right now, I think the areas within the ecological restoration where projects could actually be conducted are pretty limited. That's my take on it, right or wrong. The concerns it's complicated, have to do with the width of the WUI as defined, where projects could be done in older chaparral, but where people question whether those treatments would have the risk reduction effect that would be enough that would justify the ecological problems, given the rarity of a lot of these assemblages and also how fragmented they are and their value for a lot of other species, as Member Los Huertos said. The other issue, of course, is fuel breaks. And there is a lot of concern in this community in particular that fuel breaks are not to get ahead of what we're talking about, but just to sort of summarize what the issues are to people that have these concerns, that the fuel breaks are if either the existing fuel breaks and doing maintenance on them, or new fuel breaks would be a corridor for introduction of invasives. So I think we all understand what the concerns are, but the team has put so many limitations on these projects through already, and it mostly has to do with the age of the chaparral, that the concern comes down to, I think, mostly concern over the width of the WUI more than anything else, because a lot of these areas are so small that the WUI, if you allow treatment in WUI that far away from the WUI edge, it really does take up all of it.
Yeah.
And that, I know from working in the Park Service, that was a major concern at Santa Monica Mountains. And we got comments from the park staff as well as the superintendent on this document, which is unusual, for that to happen.
Well, it could be that what's missing here, and I'd have to go back to see it's not there, is a statement that affirms the value of local islands of intact ecological assemblages. I mean, we all know, or a high proportion of us, I think everyone who's born has some training in ecology, and we all know how important that is. We know how important it is as restoration. There have been even the very high-level cases, right, of the refugia in places like the Canal Zone in Panama being the basis for biodiversity there, once you were allowed to come back. So if, in fact, there's not a statement that within the WUI, islands of intact systems should be prioritized, then maybe that's a deficiency in the document, and I'm going to have to go back and reread it, because I can't hold a document this
right.
big in my short-term memory.
Well, I think it is missing. At least I don't know that I found it in my reading. And
There are quite a few comments on that.
Yeah, when you look at
we don't want to be a sacrifice zone,
No.
or perceived as. So we want.
That's right. So let's make
go
that
back
homework,
and
let's go back and check that, because it's a very legitimate
well, I think
concern.
when people, there's actually quite a bit of, at the local level in Southern California in particular, well, everywhere, the level of expertise with use of GIS, ArcGIS in particular, to overlap these layers with what people know to be there is what is generating a lot of this concern, because the overlap will actually take up large areas because of the size of it and the number of houses that generate where the WUI is, because they're everywhere. Almost.
I pretty much wrote that up, got about 2/3 done writing a paper on that years ago as GIS was developing, because I thought that would be the big avenue for citizen science to really become real. But
And
it's true.
I'll just say that the same concern exists in where I live in Marin County.
Yeah.
When we did try to do
So
vegetation management.
So we circle back around to this issue I brought up. It's the same in my mind, from practical boots on the ground implementation of this. When you think of that, I always think of that BMP forester that was down in Ventura. And so when we say we want to have unique ecological types or areas of unique fauna, what do we mean by that? Because a lot of things we tend to check, and they're already required to check, tend to be individual species. So native plants. There isn't really, that I know of, an area of, other than if you get to like Nature Conservancy, to NatureServe, and some large-scale databases that are U.S. in nature, they go cover the whole U.S., that would identify a polygon that would fall within a project footprint that would say, this is an ecologically reserve or a key area. Just those, and those that exist, just aren't that many of them.
Right, but
So
if in fact we're not providing a placeholder, if the bright line between those definitions of the objectives in the WUI and the methods and the objectives in ecological restoration aren't clear in the document, it may be as simple. There is no reason for a bleed from the WUI back into the restoration, but there may need an affirmation back in the WUI that, to the extent that you can identify something like this. Now, I would think.
I think that's what you just said. To the extent you can identify it,
and
kind of key.
You can think of unique elements like that.
Right.
Just think of the first habitat conservation plan in the country, the San Bruno Blue, right? So you can have an intensely localized situation with something that is unique.
So what you're suggesting is having some broad text to instruct the
something
forester to consider that, to add that to the list that they already have.
And that a citizen can walk into a meeting on the
Whether it-
unit plan and say, this is unique on this basis, and therefore going into this with a masticator is simply inappropriate in a WUI zone.
Yeah, the fear is that we're going to find every single location is unique for some other bizarre reason. So then we're going to be stuck. Do you guys, is there language at all of what we're talking about in the document? You guys know?
I don't believe it's going the way that the exact definition from ecological back into WUI, as has been discussed.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, I guess the only mechanism would be the consultation with Fish and Wildlife, and if they brought that knowledge to the table, that's one mechanism, but it's not explicit towards protecting these patches of biodiversity.
Right.
Well,
Right.
I do think that is one of the reasons they were disappointed that we didn't switch from WHR to CalFlora.
Right, although it was
CalFlora.
clear that system wasn't ready to be switched
Well,
to.
yeah.
No,
Sort of.
it's not
Yeah,
for a
it's not ready.
statewide, not for a statewide
Yeah,
program.
not for a statewide program. Yeah.
So, right.
And that was a lot of the reason, though, because that system, where it's been implemented fully, is more does link more closely to these kinds of concerns about these kinds of communities.
So the accommodations made for some of the chaparral communities in certain counties in Southern California where there is consultation, we're kind of beyond that. We're taking a broader look, because I looked at that and I thought, okay, there's accommodation for consultation. I mean, the point about bringing CNPS in, I had the same thought. It's like, that's not a regulatory agency, so that's rather extraordinary to me, and I was going to question that.
Well, I would hope they'd be involved. It's just privileging one organization.
Right.
Isn't
Right. I'm a long-term CNPS member myself, so I'm fine with that, except just the mechanism of that one group. So I'm clear that we're really talking about something much broader in terms of all other ecosystems, special elements of ecosystems all across the state. Because are we seeing, maybe I'm just generalizing too much in that, just thinking that a lot of the public comment was geared toward the Central Coast and Southern coastal areas.
I think that's the most active groups too, right?
Right.
Yeah. Certainly, you've got a few people probably very interested in sort of the Ione and Serpentine in the Sierra Nevada or the Trinity Mountains, and they I don't think they had an organizing group to generate a bunch of letters.
That's right, and that's why it's the general consideration of the use of those programs. And so whether it was brought to our attention by the Central Coast Advocates or the Sierra, it's the general principle that needs to go in. So,
okay, it seems like we could fashion something that should be able to bring those.
I would hope. Yeah.
No, I think we're going to find we can do something on that. Okay.
Remember, Wade, was there more that you were going to say? I kind of jumped on.
Oh no,
part of your conversation, but I wasn't sure if you were going to say more.
No, that was really just looking at biofine in particular, and making sure that I understood that we're talking about something broader than that.
The last two things I noted in this general category of the equiteering and whether or not we were in compliance with what this document is supposed to be doing. Briefly on one comment was that this document was not responsive to the scientific review from the Fire Science Consortium. And I actually don't believe that's a credible statement. I think it was very responsive. And so, and I've spoken directly to many members of the Fire Science Consortium about that. And actually, they felt it was responsive in a way that, many of those scientists have been involved in a number of efforts like this, and they actually felt this was a pretty good example of somebody asking what they thought and listening to them. So that one we can come back to in a second, but I want to put the other one on the table too, which is the whole issue of the cumulative impacts.
Chairman, what question number are you looking at
Oh,
exactly?
there's, I think, two different comments in here, both of which talk about the responsiveness to the Fire Science Consortium review, both of them labeled as Vtpeir.
Is there a number? Do you have their number on the side of the chart?
I could probably dig it out.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I was trying to find that too.
But
It's okay. Well, I can sort it out later.
Number, the top one on, or 186. 186 is one.
yeah, there was enough overlap on these. I was trying to deal with them as general themes. But
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fine. Really, please keep going.
But the other was the cumulative impacts, and this was, of course, something we all care deeply about. But in part, this is an experiment of trying to do things the right way. And so I think the commitment in this document to developing some kind of a monitoring feedback loop on the effects of these that is the critical element of whether we can deal with the cumulative impacts or not, is whether or not we're actually going to, end up doing what it takes, which is sometimes take 10% of project costs and put it back into assessment and actually gather that data and have a real feedback loop where we say this works or it doesn't. And so I felt the document had moved the agency a long way towards doing what I considered a credible job of cumulative impacts analysis. So I don't view this as deficiency. I view it as a commitment to actually enable that to happen and, in fact, create an accountability for the agency to do it. So I don't know how the rest of the board react.
In order to inform, to make adjustments as necessary.
Exactly.
I think that's the cumulative effects analysis is the heart and soul of the whole thing, really. Because and I think it's well done in that regard, adequately for the programmatic level.
Yeah. But I think there were 3 or 4 of the comments in this category that touched on the cumulative impacts dimension. But it is actually the gathering of data at the project level that's the sine qua non if we're actually going to get there.
Could you summarize what data we're going to collect at the project level? I can't remember where that is.
Well, what are our treatment protocols? Yeah. So they're not well specified in the document. It would be, in one sense, just the capturing of the spatial data as we move forward. And that comes into some of the other discussions we've had on the board about the importance that we place on the agency making the spatial capture of data from this and other activities on the landscape available to the public in a way that's really accessible, right? So that we can move away from kind of priesthood databases to public databases.
Yep.
There should be some sort of assessment requirement in there on the vegetation composition for anything that's justified on ecological restoration. So maybe that's something we need to go back in there and look as to how that would be specified or developed at this level. I'm blanking on what was it on that.
Yeah.
So that's something for us to go back and double check.
Appendix I lists out those requirements.
So that's in Appendix I?
Yeah, Appendix I.
So Appendix I is basically a requirement to do what we consider to be project level, very basic monitoring requirements, as well as programmatic tracking geospatially.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is a commitment to then take it one step further with once additional funding, because we had to figure out what we could require in terms of monitoring, having, potentially you're working with groups of landowners with access issues, and so these are things that could all be done during a short life of a project, and that we could have the project proponents or agency staff, department staff actually do it out on the ground while equipment's still out there.
So we should relook at Appendix I on that.
That's Appendix I. And then there's the other commitment again, which is to ultimately pursue a more formal adaptive management approach, which is, to me, looking at those more detailed issues. We do have some very basic, did you achieve your objectives in terms of effectiveness monitoring, but they're very kind of sort of low-cost type monitoring techniques, like photo point. You want to know that what you did was meaningful for risk reduction, and so a before and after is a pretty powerful way to track that.
Mm-hmm. I can see where that's fairly easy to do in the WUI kind of interfaces, that fuel loading, pre and post treatment is fairly straightforward.
And I think for
but I'm trying to think, does Appendix I, sorry that I'm not keeping all this in my head better than I am, so what's the equivalent of achieving a number of trees per acre? What's the analog to a post-harvest analysis? So we authorize a THP, you go in there, and you have a requirement to, get a certain number of trees per acre back in the ground in a certain number of years. And so have we specified a path that would get us to something on an ecological restoration project, given that, as Member Husari has pointed out, the complexity of defining what is an intact assemblage in an objective fashion is very tough.
So there is what we call project-specific requirements.
Right.
And one of those metrics may be a specific requirement at the project level. And there is a mechanism to track whether that was achieved. Mm-hmm. So I assume that if it's a metric, that you'd want to go in after treatment and see if you achieved that metric. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to rely generally on things like photo point monitoring, right, and then really use a more formal adaptive management approach to really kind of answer those questions. Not at 100% sample level, but at a more kind of...
No, I can see where transects of species abundance for some of the plants in an area would be essential for that. And whether or not you... Yeah.
So one of the reoccurring themes in restoration ecology is you don't set out explicit goals, you don't measure the right things, and then no one knows what success is. Right. So I suspect that maybe some of the concerns in the background that we haven't specified what those goals are in explicit ways, so then we can't come back and measure their success. Is there ways of... What are the kind of ways that we're framing the project level goals besides fire risk reduction? And so, does it say you also need to meet number 3 in our bullet and come up with 3 ways or 2 ways that you're going to measure that? Or is there any language at all that highlights in a practical way that a broad objective that Chairman brought up at the beginning when we looked at the executive summary?
There is a mechanism to bring all the stakeholders to the table and start to discuss those issues about what constitutes, achieving objectives for risk reduction, achieving objectives for ecological protection measures, and so we have defined, we have committed as a requirement to have stakeholder meetings to try to come up with a plan to move forward on those specific issues. But there's not specific details because we figure, adaptive management has shown the history of adaptive management. It can't be unilateral. You have to bring in all the relevant stakeholders, and we just can't do that at this stage of the document, but we can commit to entering a process at a later date and once funding is available to start to develop a more robust, formal adaptive management program.
Again, I don't want to short circuit this, so I'm almost... One more thought is when working along the Central Coast, one of the coolest things that we've been able to do is start this whole citizen monitoring reef check thing where basically thousands of people love to scuba dive, and now they have a purpose with a little whiteboard and they can record things while they're scuba diving. There's a ton of opportunity here, going back to the citizen science stuff, that I'd hate to see to cut everything off is when we get enough funding. Because you may have a whole bunch of people that are super excited about this if you can get them invested in it from a programmatic level to create space for that up front. so that
I think we have a
units-
mechanism for that.
Okay, and
I think we do.
great.
Now, I do recognize that there's not funding, and I know that there's volunteers out there and tapping into that. We would have a mechanism to be able to tap into
perfect.
a volunteer monitoring
Yeah.
that was available.
Well, if I could add to remember we're working on a lot of cases private land.
I know.
Yeah.
And
That's a
that's
public
something.
sequel.
Yeah, but in the case where prescribed fire is the tool that's been chosen for a project. Remember, there's a requirement in the prescribed burn plan that one of the first thing you do is create quantifiable objectives, and the quantifiable objectives depend on the project. You know what project type you're doing of the three broad categories, but usually the quantifiable objectives that are going to be developed have to do with a requirement. You know, it's different in forested types, obviously, than it is in chaparral. But in chaparral, it usually has to do with removing a percentage, and sometimes there are patch size requirements and that is where the interaction would occur, where there's a discussion of how much of the brush cover are you proposing to remove. There's a tension between that and the project level requirements, which has to do with not removing so much that you have erosion. So that's where that conversation occurs, or I would envision it occurring, is removing enough to have an effect on fire behavior, while still leaving enough that you don't. And so usually, I mean, a lot of the burn plans that I've written for brush, you know, the sweet spot's around 40%. And I don't know what you have. I mean, I can't remember in the prescribed. You know, there's a set of instructions for how to write a burn plan. I think where people have more concerns are that we haven't, you know, about timing. Because the timing of burning has a lot to do with whether you preserve or, you know, the level of biodiversity because of the chaparral, you know, the seed source and all that kind of thing. But it's a little bit easier to control things when you're looking at mechanical methods of removal. But there does seem to be a lot of concern in some of the comments about using mechanical means and herbicide, and we'll get to that when we get to another section that we're going to talk about later. But I do think, you know, it comes down to quantifiable objectives when you're designing a project. You know, foresters are really used to writing quantifiable objectives for, you know, you do it all the time. When we're talking about removing fuel, there's sort of a vacuum there when we're removing fuel through mechanical means and it doesn't have economic value. And I think that's kind of at the edge of, not of science, but of what practitioners are doing.
Sure.
Right. Any more comments before I'd like to move into some treatment of some of the comments on program effectiveness before it's ready to move that direction? So some of those comments are fairly easy to deal with, you know, in your kind of your spreadsheet of comments. They sort of start on about page 9. But for instance, there's several that actually talk about is biofuels potentially something to work with on here to achieve our objectives? And the answer is maybe, but and the board is quite active in that whole issue of the bioenergy situation as it deals with mortality through whatever means. But I didn't feel that that's something we can really incorporate in here, in part because of the difficulties that Wade could lecture us on the whole biomass markets and stuff, but that's kind of a social setting outside the programmatic, and so those were fairly easy to deal with. There were some comments here that were on both sides of the herbivory issue, which I thought was interesting, and I think, absent the board wanting to respond, we've actually revitalized the RMAC. We've tried to incorporate herbivory as a potential, thinking of it as a treatment mechanism, and I don't think it's consistent with the board's policy thrust over the last couple of years to say herbivory is something that we would call out as a failed approach or inappropriate. So that one, I'll pause there for a second. Just anybody had a reaction the same way to the kind of yay herbivory, nay herbivory comments that we're getting in here?
It's only described as being 10% of the treatments overall. So.
Right. So it's not major, but it reflected, I felt, a judgment about herbivory that the board had been willing to say that herbivory is inappropriate. I think we'd actually come down on the side of saying that there are situations where herbivory on private land isn't entirely does have some value in achieving some of the objectives under the VTP.
Even on the state wildlife areas, that's a management tool, and the follow-up treatment side too. I mean, I think that's the primary use.
I realize it's controversial, and you get into interesting divergences between, say, national parks and state parks, and the interpretation of herbivory as an ecologically driven process, but. So I didn't feel that I was comfortable responding to the biomass thing in terms of the scope of what our thing is. And in this case, I think we're actually on record as saying herbivory should not be taken out as a tool out of the management basket just from the start. It has to be appropriate, but there are places where it's appropriate, there's places where it's not.
Right.
Well, I think, the reality of it is, what was the percentage of the total of SRA that was in ranch lands? No, I mean, actually already is.
Yeah.
I believe it was
I don't remember what
40, 50%.
It is, yeah.
And so it seems very strange to me that we wouldn't acknowledge that herbivory is going on as a primary purpose of the private landowners on lots, on a very high percentage of the lands already. And we're simply saying that it's happening already, and in many cases it has the benefit, besides raising cattle or whatever you're raising, of removing fuel at the same time.
Although, obviously, we recognize the tension is there on the field trip we took to the Central Coast as we were standing on a private ranching area. Different members of the public that were there watching it had very different reactions to the existence of cattle ranching in that county or not, right? And the resulting change in vegetation. So those two were fairly easy. Another thing that came up and quickly for me on program effectiveness very quickly was statements about, well, we need to recognize that the simplest way to protect structures is, actually sort of, well, he didn't say not building in there, but close to not building, but having appropriate defensible space and building standards. Yeah. And I do feel we recognize that. That's not, it's a true statement. I think it's manifestly true in the programs of CAL FIRE in terms of what we emphasize. Certainly, if you ask me if I was writing my obituary right now, I would say he was proudest of the study he did of the effect of vegetation clearance and roof type in the Santa Barbara fire is the single most useful study he ever did, even though it was statistically the simplest. So I think we do know this is true, that you design homes well for the risks they're exposed to, that you have good building codes. The board is very actively engaged in that. RPC, our meetings are dominated by trying to have kind of a governance infrastructure for the state that addresses that objective. It's just not what we do here. But it is a true statement, and we can acknowledge that.
Yeah.
I think we could, you can always write things better, but I do think in our efforts to not make the VTP EIR about the first 100 feet, that is the responsibility of the landowner to pay for, at least for now, we may have confused some of the people that are talking about house.
Right? Why aren't you focusing on that?
Yeah, the house, and I
As
think
an omission, yeah.
Yeah, I think we still could do a better job of explaining that by law people are required to do that. It's just that the way that the law is currently written, CAL FIRE cannot pay for it.
Right.
Except in the context of things like community chipping programs and disposal and all that kind of stuff. So that we could, I think part of what happened with this WUI and the definition of WUI, some of the wording could be fixed a little bit, but at this point the team's done a lot of work on that, but it looks like people, in many of these comments, people are really confused about that. That it's as though we were saying that, a lot of the comments read as though we were saying that the material next to the house is not that important. All we're saying is that this particular analysis doesn't cover the first 100 feet.
So I think
I would add on to that. That's I think Mark was nailing it too.
Yeah.
There's this omission almost, like it's not, if we don't explicitly say it's happening, then that means it's not happening. And that goes for the building structures and the codes and the 4297 both. And so if we're seeing this enough in a lot of different comments, worded slightly differently sometimes, somewhere in the document we need to make it, or maybe in a couple places we need to make it clearer. Because obviously it's being missed.
Perhaps the executive summary would be a place to reinforce it.
Yeah.
that's true. I reread the executive summary just before this meeting, and it could actually be a good placeholder there as to what the focus was.
Yeah.
So, and it's not a lot of writing.
No, I'm thinking a paragraph that
That would cover
states
it.
that would just state that our understanding is that structure are important, and adherence to the 4290 standards are important, but we also believe that going beyond there is also a critical component of protecting the WUI from the citizens and the citizens from the WUI, right? It goes both ways.
Yeah.
I think it can be handled probably in a paragraph.
Conveniently, Kevin has done that and has a draft circulating with us already.
Awesome.
Sweet.
Check. Damn,
We did something today. Yeah, but
No, they did something.
I know.
That's our goal, right? We take away their work.
Well, that's real important. So I think as people read through this and take the time, that they're looking for solutions instead of what we're proposing to do something else that,
And it highlights the constrained system that we're working in. We really don't have a lot of. We've got a couple places we can work on risk, and this is one that we haven't had a lot of engagement. Where we've got these other areas, we have some pretty explicit tools that we can use.
Right.
And we're kind of handicapped without this.
Yeah.
And we can kind of talk about this as like, this is an area that we can't protect the wildlands because we don't have the capacity to do anything right now.
So, good.
But we need to make sure that we just reinforce that existing structures that a lot of the new laws that have to do with new construction do not affect existing structures, and so far we haven't tackled that as a society because we don't require people to go back in and retrofit unless they are planning a major remodel.
Right, which of course is how we deal with every natural hazard.
Right,
in the
exactly.
So fire's not unique. It's how we deal with floodplains. It's how we deal with seismic safety issues.
Everything.
That's the social path we've chosen. If you get into the natural hazards literature, and when we have bad experiences, we have windows of opportunity where you engage in things like coming up with regulations on fire safety for the new construction. All right. There's another thread that runs through this program effectiveness statements that sort of challenges this document as to whether it actually incorporates climate change adequately. And I had mixed feelings about that. It's certainly an area of work that's near and dear to my heart. Having worked some on the background for AB 32 myself. And in part, I don't feel that at the very high level you can incorporate this based on what I know of the science of this. So if I think about the work that's been done on the effect of climate change, which is playing out over much longer than this document would be revised, right? See, I see this document as maybe having a 10 to 20 year lifespan while you're accumulating evidence as to how it should be revised. The evidence of, say, you look at the studies that were done by people like Moritz and Beisinger of the effect of climate change on vertebrates in the Sierra, or the work that's been done by David Ackerley on the effect of climate change on vegetation in different parts of the state, and you see how complex those movements are. And I think it's a continual process of adaptation. The probability with which we can forecast the impact on vegetation communities, the complexity of spatial patterns, it's fascinating science, but it's still in its very early stages. And we know from those studies by people like Moritz and Beisinger and Ackerley that the story's going to be a lot more complex than things move north and uphill. It's much more complex than that, and the effect on redwoods of what this does to the marine air layer in terms of how the redwood, both as forest and as an ecological assemblage, will react to a change in the availability of fog. It's a fascinating story, but it's tough to see how stuff like that, given the kind of the error bars on our predictions on the impacts on ecological communities, how you change this document from what it is at the project level in the near term. I think it becomes important, again, that we look at that whole issue in Appendix I. How do you do feedback monitoring? Because I think the effects of some of these treatments may, over the space of even just 2 decades, become very different. That something that looks like it's a good method to deal with a situation, especially in the ecological restoration category, may change over time. And so the sort of the low spatial scope of the projects that are envisioned in here actually make me think it's a good time to accumulate some science over the probable lifetime of this on a fairly limited amount of acreages, because that kind of adaptation is important. But I don't see the error bars on that science or the need to start having our management activities generate a basis for our future management as saying that's a reason that this document is inadequate. I think it's, to me, an affirmation of the importance that we get that kind of monitoring and adaptive management framework worked out.
So you're getting at future climatic changes.
Yeah.
More than some metrics to measure the effect of a project versus not doing something.
That's absolutely right. And, we have not even gotten, I think, to the point where the board's not in a place to say, I don't think we have social agreement yet on the importance of maintaining ecological assemblages in their current locations, or dealing with the sort of migration of home ranges and so forth that would occur under this. Is this something to anticipate and assist, or so it goes so far beyond what we can deal with in how we'd evaluate the 30 to 60,000 acres that would actually take place under this program. That I really feel that's people think in terms of cumulative impacts. I think in part we may be more important to be gathering the data currently rather than relying on science that's 20 and 30 years old. It's kind of we need a constant stream of measurements as the climate changes, and we need to be creating the science that will be relevant for the people that are on this board 20 years from now. So that's how I view those statements, and I'll shut up there and turn it to the rest of you guys as to how you feel about that. Member Andre.
Well, I just had ecological restoration term definition up, and it kind of hits on that, and maybe I'd like to hear what you think in regards to what you just said, because reestablishing the composition, structure, pattern, integrity, and ecological processes necessary to facilitate terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem sustainability, resilience, and health under current and future conditions. So at the core of that definition of what that ecological restoration is, I guess, and the treatment here, it's talking about current and future conditions, which requires us to think about predicting or monitoring and adapting, I guess, to information that allows you to put together a structure, an ecological restoration project that's anticipating change, right? But I was looking for the comment that was kind of making it seem like we had
For instance, if you look at comment A21 from Szymanski with Santa Monica Mountains, look on page 12 of your spreadsheet, does not offer appropriate solutions to problems of a changing environment or
You mean from the superintendent, David Szymanski? It's on 91, isn't it?
But it's not the only one that brought up climate change in this section. I really was just noting the best one because the comments were similar, and so I was picking up exemplars of the statements, not the list of them. And I think that's true, and I think that's a deficiency of all of our approaches on this, that it's a dynamic world, and our processes need to be dynamic with them. So I think we had both of our candidates agree last night that climate change is real. Yes.
Well,
or at least one of them.
Whatever.
Not the right thing to talk about that.
No, so I think we're...
Staff politely requests we stick to the noticed items on the agenda.
Thank you.
All right. So,
well, as far as the climate change thing goes, your focus on how vegetation will change in response, elevationally. I think we kind of invited some of these comments because there is a fairly, there is quite a bit of information about the direct effects of climate change on vegetation distribution because of changes in weather, rainfall, whatever. It's because we focused in the document on changes to the fire regime.
Yes.
And it is true that the changes to the fire regime, people have there's been quite a bit of writing that proposes that those are playing out much more quickly.
They certainly are.
Than changes that are just because of longer burning periods in any given day. So that there is a general perception, and we reinforced it because there was a couple symposia on that topic that suggested that climate change is responsible for these fires getting much larger and so forth really rapidly, even though there's a lot of other factors that influence that. So it's in the document.
Yeah.
I mean, it's on page, there's several citations.
Yes.
In chapter 1, I think, right?
4.
Yeah. It's through the document that fire regimes are changing. And because fire regimes are changing and fires are bigger and more intense, that, there's more impacts on vegetation. And I think, some of the fires that we have personally observed, like the King Fire, they're way outside of my experience and your experience, really do reinforce that.
Yeah, and I think it's true, and I think the statement about climate change matters, and I think we have incorporated something here, and I think it's a true statement in the sense that the signal is more complex than in a relatively static. If we assume that climate is static, then your interpretation of the signal from monitoring and management activity is cleaner. And so we need to evaluate all of this in terms of not just the direct feedback, but trajectories, I think is a true statement, but I don't view it was offered as a criticism of the document. Right. I don't think it's actually, I think it is a true statement, but I don't think it is a criticism of the document. I think it just highlights the importance of using the program to gather data that provides a foundation for effective management.
Yeah, I just didn't really understand some of those comments because the argument would be that if that it's even more important to do fuel treatment.
Right.
But the argument in a lot of these comments is that you didn't cover it, and I didn't actually get it.
Yeah.
And it would be good. I don't know how we respond to those comments if we don't really understand the rationale behind them.
I think part of the rationale for some comments is just the daunting dimensions of this document.
It's big.
And so
it's huge.
Going in there, it is so easy to miss the treatment of something you really care about. It's really, really easy. Yes, Member Lacertis.
I read it around type conversion, potential type conversion.
Mm-hmm. So more fire results in more type conversion?
Or just by not monitoring that, we may be losing things in the ecosystem because we're not paying attention to those specific things. So we do a treatment, climate change is happening.
We just drive it.
Or driving
even further.
Yeah.
Right. And so because I think that's why it's the project effectiveness is because if we're not, again, it's like if you're not measuring it, then you don't know what happens, and then you've got, again, it just goes back to this anecdotal information that this is my favorite place, this plant's gone, Cal Fire ruined it. It's like, okay, well, maybe not, but we don't know because we're not collecting the right data to answer that question. Or maybe it's climate change, or who knows? It's also an easy way of disrupting the process too, is to throw climate change in there because we all just like it's so big, we don't even know what scale to put it on.
That's right. And then there's climate change.
Right, exactly. Right. It's like, okay, then don't plan anything.
That's right. Yeah. So any other comments on the climate change comments here?
It's not mentioned anywhere. I'm just quickly scanning Appendix I on my phone because I didn't bring the binder with me. It's not mentioned anywhere. It is one of our forest practice rules thing that we're supposed to be looking at climate change and carbon sequestration. We don't mention carbon sequestration, as far as I can tell, in Appendix I. Is that true?
Yeah. Again, the emphasis being committing up front to this very.
I totally get it.
And then having these stakeholder groups to start developing hypotheses that you can test through formal adaptive management.
I know.
And it's kicking the can down the road a little bit, but there's all.
And that's the critique, right? Is we kick the can too far down.
I think there is a process to start determining what those important questions are.
Where's even the rudimentary monitoring supposed to be funded from? Is that
That's just going to be absorbed in project costs
by CAL FIRE?
Yeah.
Right.
Or by project proponent. So it would be project proponent.
So maybe SRA grants or something like that. They would be applying some amount of monitoring.
And some of it may be done by agencies, by department staff, and some.
Right, there may be some cost efficiencies in department staff doing a global analysis of fuel breaks and the results on invasive species. The carbon portion of this, actually, I think Mark and I would agree, the Forest Carbon Action Team is not at a point where we can say what it is we're measuring or how we do it. So, they're moving along there, but again, it's if every process waits for every other related process to finish, we will never accomplish anything.
So Chairman, what it kind of begs, though, is maybe providing direction in the either adaptive management process on themes that maybe we as the board think are important.
Yeah.
And it seemed like we just tripped across one, or maybe a couple today, where,
Well, carbon and climate change, as Member Lasorte just pointed out.
And biodiversity.
Sure, we're happy.
they just put 3. So it's not, we're not going to come up with the monitoring framework today, but maybe the themes that we feel need reinforcing.
That might be a really good thing to.
True.
So there is also a requirement. Excuse me for having written this so long ago.
I know. I'm hoping you guys will.
So there is a commitment to establishing what we call a VTP monitoring working group, and that's a stakeholder-driven process that starts where we start to try to reach consensus on key uncertainties.
Page.
That's I-11.
Thank you.
So
And does it specifically reference the issues of climate biodiversity or carbon?
It deals with them a little bit more broadly. It talks about reaching consensus on these key uncertainties regarding fuel reduction treatments in the SRA, and that may include.
So even just putting EG with those 3 objects in there
we could add
would be quite useful.
Well, maybe whether it's from the team's point of view, but then, or if it's spelled out in I, that the board in reviewing this felt these are additional items that
The highest priority items are
The highest.
High.
I'm afraid the highest.
Oh, okay. The high priority
mentioned
items
by member
for-
Los Huertos.
On September
We'll be sure to call out
27th.
names too. We're not afraid of that.
And the emphasis of this group is to not, so often monitoring data is collected and never used. But this is actually, this is about taking these questions, turning them into hypotheses, collecting data, and actually testing them.
Right.
That's the whole emphasis of that working group.
Right.
So it commits to starting that process.
Right.
And then, to me, I'm always a fan of if you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
Funding-wise. I'm pretty motivated to see that kind of process through from my end. I know that we've kind of been given support to do that once we get to that point.
Yeah.
Drew, so would it be, if we had a paragraph in Appendix I that kind of described, as the board deliberated, additional areas of uncertainty that would need adaptive management monitoring were...
It's already in there.
We've got that.
Well,
but specifically...
Well, I don't know. Are they in there or not?
No, not really.
Yeah, I'm saying adding those 3 that we just came up with,
Yeah.
and I'll give you a 4th right now based on our discussion, and a discussion I had earlier this week with the outreach people from National Geographic's foundation is the engagement of citizen science, right? So how you engage the public in monitoring is as much an issue as how these things impact carbon, right? That in some cases it's very straightforward. In citizen science, we're collect a sample, send it in, and we'll tell you if it's actually sudden of death or not, and put it on a website. And other cases, it's more complex. You know, is that species you'd say is there actually there, right?
Yeah, and to add maybe direction to Drew, where we're going to craft this, is we don't want to come off sounding like a presidential candidate when we say there's climate change uncertainties. Right? We want to be able to say that there are certain...
Ms. Hannigan, could you admonish me?
I think what I'm hearing, and I hate to recognize the good research at University of California, Berkeley, but Weisinger is putting together some of the best stuff I've seen in California. Because it opened my eyes a lot, and that a lot of the stuff I had been reading and kind of thinking about was kind of a one-size-fits-all. Everything's getting warmer and everything's getting drier, when in fact the work they're doing is, no, California is going to react very different, and it depends on where you are in the state.
Right.
Some are going to get warmer, some are going to stay flat, some are actually going to see more rain, and some are going to see a lot less rain.
It's the nature of our climate
so I
systems
think that's
and our topography.
So when I'm speaking of the uncertainties of climate change, not everybody's on board with Weisinger's work, even though he's starting to validate it with Grinnell's original work on birds that go back to the 1930s. That the uncertainty is what is exactly going to happen in a very diverse state like California.
Yeah,
that's the uncertainty I speak of, and I think is that what you're getting at?
And how do we manage that?
Yeah. So I know that's a mouthful, but
and so frame those as sort of examples.
Yeah,
rather than a commitment to explore this.
I think
right.
In my mind, what it does is it highlights the kind of comments that people feel like
denying climate change or something.
If we're only focused on fire risk, and that's the only thing mentioned in the monitoring, then again we're defining the problem narrowly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we, to get back to the citizen science, I was just looking for this section and how citizen science is addressed. I've got to figure out my new toy, how to get to a page. And so it's on page 1300 and I'm back on page 500. But I do think we need to acknowledge that we may not have all of the information within the agency or the skill sets to answer some of these questions, and that's a really good reason to bring in people who might have more of that. Because especially in Southern California, we've got basically a couple of foresters, and then we have the people at the local level who are the who basically do the GIS analysis and so forth. But the agency has never been set up with a staff of botanists, and at the state level, we have all those skills, but at the local level, I think the knowledge does rest in a lot of cases with the citizenry, and I understand why we've been asked repeatedly to consult with California Native Plant Society, because they do look at things differently and have local knowledge on plants and animals, but I think we could do a better job of saying we will reach out to local scientists and citizens and universities because we can't possibly ask two foresters in Southern California to have an encyclopedic knowledge of chaparral plants. They don't. I mean, their focus is more towards trees. So I don't know how to do that exactly, but a little bit of language that acknowledges we may not have the skill set within the agencies to do that. And Drew, if you have that, because I don't have a paper copy.
Yeah, I think we have a mechanism to do that at sort of a regional scale. We have a commitment to do these regional workshops, which we'll talk generally about program implementation and effectiveness over time, but also as a way to bring in local experts to maybe give to give a talk on maybe sensitive plant species of concern in Southern California and stuff like that. So there are venues that we offer for that. Again, that's more regional, and then I guess the sort of the project scale notification would be the other avenue, but that's not quite as formal as the workshop would be.
Jude, can you? I'm going to ask a rhetorical question. You're going to say yes, hopefully.
I like when you tell us what the answer is. I'm hoping you get the appreciation that the local people feel like that their voices aren't going to be heard, and so making that, like what you just said, that lack of specificity between the regional and the project could be really helpful to help sort of modify or mollify some of these comments in that concern that some project is going to get approved at a regional level and they weren't part of that stakeholder group because it was 50 miles away on the other side of the basin of Southern California or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that we do have we have mechanisms to ultimately make that linkage. I think some of what is termed adaptive management is also kind of trial and error learning, and
right.
That's probably we have ways to get that learning out to the practitioners eventually, just by having these regional workshops being a requirement of implementing the program, and then hopefully getting that out to where at the unit level where you have projects being vetted by the local community. Hopefully you have more informed practitioners. The stakeholders want to show up to the regional workshops, they're hopefully more informed.
Right.
And so hopefully you have a more informed people involved in this process.
And I do fear the use of the word trial and error. So I saw that in the appendix, and you might want to downplay that a little bit, because it doesn't sound like we're learning from our errors. It just sounds like we're throwing a bunch of things in where they're not maybe working. So, adaptive management's a really great term, and then you kind of have it, I think, in parentheses, it's like trial and error. I'm just not sure that really captures
right.
What
learning by doing or adaptive management or both.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess, though, to be very clear, I think we touched on this kind of, I don't think it was under this theme, but this line of question and back and forth. I know we had this, I believe, last month, because Gabe was there, and I was kind of asking the question then. And I think it was pretty clear, though, when you say local, they're not going to reach out 70 miles away on a specific project.
Yeah.
The idea is to stay within that local community. People that are being impacted, within that little area. So when that happens, there's going to be somebody, if there's a project in Ventura and they're down in San Diego, they're probably not going to get notified. Yeah. But that's the point of the project.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that, but for clarification, I guess that is kind of the plan. Mm-hmm. What I think Drew, just to restate the obvious, I think what he stated was that in these regional groups is where there may be some cross-pollination between the different groups in a regional area.
Given there's vetting at the unit level of every project that would actually be reviewed at the project level under this, our unit levels are like the level of a county, and that's a good map into the social structure of California. So, especially in the areas where this is really most of an issue, or the biggest controversial issues right now. In some cases, where the county units are smaller, the units are actually multi-county units. So I think we've got a reasonable balance there.
Right. I didn't think we did. I just
Great.
want to make sure because that's the exact issue we were talking about last time.
So
I think we were okay with it before.
So should we move on? I've got another set of themes I was pulling out. So There was, I thought, an interest. Well, I am an economist. There was an interesting statement about this, because the VTP doesn't break even, and in fact, how this is all going to be paid for is interesting. I didn't feel our treatment of the cost structure, which is rapidly evolving here, was out of line. And I actually don't think, given that there are other mechanisms to do vegetation in communities and so forth, I didn't feel all of that background was actually deficient in the document. And so unless somebody wants to pick that one up, I thought we'd move on from that. There was a series of statements, as I sort of proceed linearly through, and I'm sort of in the pages for the board members, kind of 15 through 17 range. There was a series of statements which said this essentially opens the door to a period of massive and unprecedented change. There's a couple elements that said that earlier in terms of, devegetating extensive areas of the landscape. And the truth is, I think the scale of this program says that we should simply say, in our response to those comments, this is not a massive and unprecedented program. It simply isn't. And I think those comments are objectively not founded in the document that's put here. It's given the scope of the program.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's statewide, the acreage limitation is not anywhere close to what some would like, and it's kind of throttled back in that regard.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's also there were a few criticisms embedded here in statements about the effectiveness of the program that talked about alternatives, in particular 114. And we have discussed the issue of the scope and the alternatives in our previous workshop. So I even though that theme comes back, we've had an extensive discussion of whether or not the range of alternatives was actually reasonable, or the structure of the alternatives, talking about the WUI focus as one alternative, and how that fits into the way an EIR is normally done, where you're trying to span the legal decision space, and that we probably have done that. There was an interesting comment, specifically 128 by Frank Landis, about the objectives, and that kind of goes back to the objectives, which you could find on page in the objective. If you look at the executive summary, just to find it easiest, it's E3 conceptual basis, and it lists the 5 objectives: modify fire behavior to help reduce wildlife or losses to life, property, and resources, and then is number 1. There are these others, and we say the first objective is the governing goal. This is a vegetation treatment program, and it's mainly based in the state's mandate to modify fire behavior, reduce losses to life, property, and natural resources. And it does say in the executive summary that objectives 2 through 4, relative to 1, that 1 clearly responds to the WUI stuff. But 2 through 4 are more specific links to these other values. And so I actually am not sure that this comment was based on this version of the executive summary, because I felt this kind of which objectives are operative was fairly well stated in this section, and so I think there may be a version issue here. But because it was a substantive statement about whether or not at the high level our objectives relative to the kind of treatments we were considering was adequately specified. I thought I would bring that one up for special consideration. Give you a second on that and then see if anybody wants to make a comment. I don't feel the treatment is problematic in the way it's laid out, but it was a thoughtful comment. I thought so.
If you don't mind, and probably the closest thing to a citizen scientist in this room is a stakeholder that has experience in firefighting, erosion control, GIS, and a lot of other related topics. And I'd like to ask you two questions. One, are you ever going to take a bathroom break before this is over? And two, will there be time for citizen input?
Oh, yes. Actually, we were just waiting for if anybody flags, so I have people out here, or anyone raising their hand. So, yes, we haven't had any comments because I haven't seen you raise your hand to say we have anyone there, and we'll do that. But, yeah, it is 3:10. We've been at this for 2 hours straight. Let's take a bathroom break. And sorry about that. I tend to just forge ahead, as my board members know. So anyway, call the workshop for the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection back into session. Is our streaming, we're good to go? Great. We've been plowing through a bunch of the comments on the sequitering issues and the program effectiveness commentary that we've received in public comment. We had not had any requests yet for public comment from people in the online version, so I'm going to turn now just to make sure we have anyone that would like to make comment that's in the room.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Please.
I started firefighting officially.
Identify yourself.
My name's Andy Colonna, resident in here.
Can you spell that, please?
Collonna.
Thank you.
Andy.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Before I came to California, I had approximately 6 years of firefighting and fire suppression and control and prevention on the East Coast, North Kingstown Fire Department. Cross-trained with Navy firefighters and divers. And since then, I've been really involved with the whole idea of restoration and recovery, which implies securing what's left of whatever you've got, whether it's a human being or a resource, and trying to graft on good tissue and prevent it from getting any worse. And so we guys have got an adaptive management thing going on here, which is perfect, but adaptive management really means trial and error or success. You have to monitor and evaluate to determine if something works. In that case, keep doing it and spread the word that it works and try it and use it in other places. And if not, stop doing it and do something else, or nothing may be a better alternative. Okay. So the Forest Service has, I've reviewed a lot of forest plans over the years and worked with the Forest Service to develop alternatives to herbicides from Lower Trinity District to the Six Rivers all the way to D.C. to this Council of Environmental Quality. And, we've been coupling those people with the Forest Service and changed policy where herbicides was considered to be, especially aerial spraying, to be a last resort rather than a first resort. Okay. We showed them that by cutting the brush and thinning at the same time in the younger plantations, we could get the brush to decay faster and get a net return on the investment, whereas spraying was often hit or miss, and it left the leaves on the trees, on the deciduous, the hardwoods, for a long period of time, increasing the fire danger rather than decreasing it over time. And gradually they realized, besides the chemical, the problems with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and so on, that they had a problem with 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, and they gradually have phased it out until this GMO thing where 2,4-D is making a comeback, which is kind of crazy in its own right. But anyway, with the Forest Service, they came up with, in their forest planning documents, a whole idea of monitoring. And they think that they perfected it, and I think we should use it. Because they have 5-year increments of monitoring over time, and 3 levels of monitoring. 1, implementation. 2, results and effects. Was the project implemented the way it was designed under the contract? 2, did it produce the result that was projected in the project? 3, was it effective for a dollar cost effectiveness for the overall planning objectives, goals and objectives, which brings up another thing. You've got objectives, and you put number 1 is different from the other 4, which brings up something that I learned way back when, that you have to, in my military science training, you have to distinguish between a goal and an objective and a tactic. So, with the Constitution, which all our laws are based on, to form a more perfect union is more of a goal, because that's what a Constitution does. But the objectives that have to be met in the order they need to be accomplished is their strategy. So, for example, you establish justice. Only then can you ensure domestic tranquility. Only then can you provide for the common defense. Only then can you promote the general welfare. Only then can you secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So the same thing here. If you have a planning, a mission statement, you have a problem, you have goals, objectives, and tactics and methods, a plan to implement to make it happen. And so evaluating these plans and these approaches to fire control and climate change and all that, I'd say you have a hell of a lot of data now, especially since I pushed for a geographic information feasibility study for the Klamath Fisheries Restoration Task Force in '89, when they weren't even going to put it in the long-range plan. And some of my buddies and I that worked with the Forest Service before went into mapping and stuff and realized that we could help them to produce a GIS, and they bought our idea and incorporated it into the long-range plan for effectiveness and value monitoring. So that opened up an incredible avenue of information, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. Thanks to Nixon's initiative, NASA liberated the Landsat 45 series that was the spy satellite information to be used. It was declassified for non-military resource planning on private and public lands in 1972. Right about the time that the Forest Practice Act was passed, the Endangered Species Act, federal and state NEPA, CEQA, all that stuff was happening around that time. So it's a really good demarcation line to see what's happened before all of that and after. You can take that satellite imagery into every 5 years and come up with areas that are like typically managed or poorly managed, better managed, and start gathering really good data on any place you want that's covered by that data, and come up with the geologic, the aerial photos from USGS and all the field studies and so on, and plug that in, and you can monitor and evaluate what's worked or not over a period of time, including the whole idea of using clear cutting on private lands and then going to the federal system to get the timber off the federal lands to make up for the shortfall because they overcut and didn't replant on the private lands. These are really well documented facts. I wish it weren't true. So now you've got fire and all that and climate change. Well, if you look at the idea of reflective versus absorptive and how that changes the fog issue, for example, that you talked about earlier, the more clear cutting that went on, the more light got reflected, whereas the canopy that was there, dark green, would absorb that light coming in and make it work as photosynthetic action. So you have a carbon sink. Now, with so many clear cuts and the burning off the fog, it gets drier sooner, stays drier longer, and the fuel load gets dried out to the point where ignition is much easier to happen with a lightning strike, and spread with these large plantations all over the place is inevitable. And so you get a situation where there's a feedback loop in there where you get fire more easily started in the afternoon before the wind picks up, and then it picks up coming up this trough in the ocean, pushes it up slope, fire, spreads through the plantations and gets into the upper canopy that's either thin or not managed at all. And then you have, by dark, you have a forest fire and with crown fires and so on. I've been in 3 of them, 2 in the East Coast and 1 here. It's not fun. And I've lost at least one friend that I can document that died because of it. It's a real pain in the ass, okay? So to get over that, the whole idea of select cutting and so on is now in vogue. Even people that were normally wanted to do it are not doing it. But we've inherited a perfect storm that you guys are stuck with having to deal with. And the way that I think you're going to have to deal with it is to get rid of all the denial and everything else and start really looking at this data on forest regions, so on, typical example right now was the fire recovery project in the West Side Klamath Forest. You got a situation that you guys really need to be aware of. We have private industry owning part of the watershed in the Salmon District, okay, Forest Salmon area, and a company that was fruit loops or fruit growers. They were making their boxes, so they had reforestation issues because they were getting the wood to make the boxes. Okay, so they have a logging operation going on up there that is controlled by CAL FIRE, and the Forest Service is adjacent to them on a checkerboard pattern. If you look at the final EIS for the West Side Fire Recovery Project, they say in there, I forget what the page number is, but that the mixed ownerships in the checkerboard pattern and the different approaches to management are making it very difficult for the Forest Service to manage their property in such a way that they can prevent erosion and the collapse of the fishery and the spotted owl habitat. You got simultaneously the Northwest Forest Plan and the Southern Oregon, Northern California overlap with spotted owl habitat and so on, as well as coho. They're documented 3.8 decline in spotted owl populations per year since the forest plan, the Northwest Forest Plan, was implemented. Again, I wish this wasn't true. Similar declines in the stream channel with coho. So we're getting the birds and the fish are telling us something, and the rate of cut is such that you're cutting in smaller and smaller diameter trees, so there's less workers in the field, so their habitat to work is getting collapsed as well. Okay, and you have automation and mechanization in the second, third growth industry. If you take a ride around here, you'll see that the log decks are coming into smaller and smaller diameter trees. Every cut in that same in a given location is sooner than it was before, and smaller trees, and less people involved in the gathering of that stuff or the milling of it. Okay, so you're moving from saw timber into particle board and strand board. It's really cynical, in a word. Okay, so the part of the problem is that the Forest Practice Act says as long as you're producing high quality timber products, but they don't say what they are. If they're saw timber, to me, that's a measure of success or failure. When you slip into this other world, you're losing the whole idea of what it is to have forest. So we're stuck in this part, but I think that there's enough data that can validate what I'm telling you is absolutely true. And part of your problem right now is you've got an EIR process that doesn't account for the National Environmental Policy Act /EIR process. But the Forest Services has to run it on that EIS. And then cutting across that is the Water Board, who has jurisdiction from the Clean Water Act over what goes on in private and federal lands. The bottom line in the resource is the stream channel, literally as well as figuratively. So now the water quality guys are complaining because they don't have the staff to go out there and monitor what Fruit Loop is doing. I mean, Fruit Loop, or fruit growers, whatever. And so there's a cluster out there, a perfect storm of mismanagement that's going on, and no one is addressing it successfully.
We should.
Well, that's the bottom line.
So I'm just saying, this has been 12 minutes.
All the efforts that you're making here to go around and figure out what these comments are and all that, are not, in my opinion, missing the point unless you do an overview that takes these issues and items into account.
No, appreciate that. And you're right, that management across lines is a problem. Management in the other direction from the one you mentioned is brought to our attention by private landowners is as significant a problem as the problem from the Forest Service out. We've been in meetings on that. The coordination with the different boards, clearly within our scope and very much on the board's agenda, which is why we've had at least one joint meeting, and we'll have others with the Northwest Regional Water Quality Plan, because we're the policy board for the lead agency on THPs, but there are other two agencies that are involved that respond to other boards. So there's a lot of good observations there, and I appreciate your comment about what the fundamentals of adaptive management are, and kind of is, if you start from the modify, which is the tactic, to the second half of objective number one. The objective part of it's the second half. And the grafting of the portion about modify fire behavior on the front was to try and give context specifically to this as a VTP EIR. So that first statement is a hybrid, but if you just truncate after the first 4 words, I think it becomes an objective. So good points. Okay.
Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess to add on to that, because the point's made about monitoring.
Yeah.
I know you've been at the effectiveness monitoring committee meetings.
Yeah.
And Drew, I think, one of the comments I think I had along with some other board members was to make that appendix out a little more robust and talk about what is an implementation versus effectiveness and all that. I think you did a good job of using those terms and putting those in there. So at least the concerns about the monitoring side of it and what types that we try to achieve over time is in there.
Yeah.
Our implementation monitoring is modeled after the Forest Service is kind of BMPEP approach.
Right.
Yeah. We distinguish those terminologies really well, I think. And so I think that. So hopefully we will address at least a small portion of what you were commenting
at
on.
least some of that. Okay, I wanted to hit a couple more topics that we were running close to our agendized time here. And as I keep going through program effectiveness, if we look at some of the comments, like specifically 152, there's a counterpoint to the statements that this programmatic description is unprecedented in its scope, but then there's the countervailing point that 60,000 acres is simply pointless because it's so small. And so
in the same letter.
Which is interesting, and I think that reflects kind of a tension about the program in a general way, but the 60,000 acres was based on our interpretation, if you'll remember, of our prior discussions as to what feasible alternatives really were, which are defined both in terms of governance, scale of expansion, social acceptability.
And it's not the only program or tool out there.
That's right. So I think the response to those is probably. There are several statements under program effectiveness to say there isn't any scientific objective evidence that California forests are burning at unusual levels or unnatural levels. And in fact, there is a table in here which I think is saying, I realize there is disagreement on this point, but I think the consensus in the table, which shows what's actually been acreage burning recently, and a few, I think, pretty substantial papers in the literature would say that, in fact, we are experiencing an increase in the acres burned, and that we anticipate that problem could get worse. So, I mean, just evidence of acres burned in the state, I think, is part of our response here. And, if I didn't go back and double check to see that we quoted the paper by Stevens, for instance, that could be pointed to address that, but we could put that in the response because I think.
Yeah, I know that we are kind of aware there is sort of a dueling literature thing going out between certain authors, and so I think we mentioned both authors, but I think it's really the weight of evidence, right?
So the weight of evidence is that the experience is accelerating, and that's both based on an analysis of data, but it's also it's in the formal literature, but we're also experiencing some interesting things, and I actually feel people's experience matters. And when you talk to firefighters that have been in fires like the Butte Fire or the Valley Fire recently, or the King Fire, expert opinion or people's engagement in those actual incidents actually, to me, is an augmentation to the statistical evidence that the scientific community is going through. And I do feel we're dealing with fires which are a little different, not just the frequency of very large fires, which will be, cyclical. But I don't think a statement that there is no evidence that we're experiencing an increase in fire severity or amount, or the parallel like in comment 201, that California is experiencing a deficit of fire, that they're not burning with higher sensitivity. I actually don't feel that's a correct interpretation of the literature that exists, and I don't think we need to adjust the interpretation of the literature in this document to adjust that. I think actually the team's work on this actually reflects the scientific consensus and the diverse voices within it very well. And so, forward.
Yeah, there's one area there that and this came up in the forest carbon plan too, the term catastrophic.
Yes.
I want to touch on for a moment. Maybe this is the right time because it's the uncharacteristic fuel loads that have led to, I guess, uncharacteristic is the term I prefer over catastrophic large fires or severe fires. Edith
or mega fires.
Yeah.
Got into the.
Yeah, Edith looked, and I have a list of all the pages where catastrophic is used, and some of it times it's used in reference to the National Fire Plan, which uses it. That's probably fine, but I would like us to consider a substitute term there because it is kind of a histrionic media.
That's right.
Thing.
We want to avoid her.
But we don't have a definition of it either.
Severity. I know that for soil water stuff, severity works well for that and for vegetation. So we could kind of look and see higher severity
or uncharacteristic.
Trending toward higher severity.
I've saved your email.
We got this feedback too on the
Yeah.
state on the forest carbon plan too. That's a lot of the public sessions on vetting that draft, right?
Right. Well, the two dimensions ecologically would be larger and high severity, and or you can substitute, be more specific, and go straight to fire index. This kind of thing, and say it's fire intensity. The catastrophic, I think, actually, in my reading of the literature, is better when it's speaking about losses to infrastructure.
Yeah, the socio-economic
that it is a
side,
catastrophe
right.
when you have an Oakland fire that burns up 3,000 homes and 500 apartment units.
Even though that kind of fire might be within the ecological parameters of an area, and it's not outside the norm.
But it is a social
But
catastrophe.
you're talking about, right.
And with deaths and evacuation and so forth. So I think it's a good comment, and
and I've saved your email to that.
Okay.
I have a stack of growing papers. So, yeah.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that, Sue? This is very much in your
scope.
Yeah,
I think it seems to me that a lot of these comments, the document says the same thing, just in a slightly different way, and they sort of like pass each other in the night.
Yeah.
I've been thinking for a while about how to kind of bring that, because the VTPEIR says the same thing as most of these comments, but these comments say that the document doesn't say these things. And one thing that sort of brings it all together is the Fire Science Consortium document, which we talk about, but is it in here?
Because it's a commentary on an early draft, it actually becomes a very misleading thing to put up now relative to this document.
And we also didn't. I'm sorry.
No, please.
Well, we revised the last document based on the fire. That was one component of this new draft, and this draft is owned by the board, and we weren't intending and aren't intending that this draft is solely based on those recommendations, and we don't want it to be kind of like a checkbox. We did this, we did that, but so that's why it's not. Although it's available online, it's a public document. It's not incorporated as part of this EIR.
Well, yeah, but it does explain a few things. A lot of these comments say. If you read that document, it does, Scott does estimate the number of acres that would have burned under so-called natural conditions to some point in the historical past. And they are large. And so a lot of these comments say, hey, you're not outside the the natural range of variability because, many more acres burned in the past. But they burned at mixed severity over long periods, not in one burning period or 5 burning periods, being augmented by burning out and all that kind of thing that focus the severity on larger areas.
Right, not large and high intensity. It's large, high intensity.
Right. So I don't.
And so
I don't think that. There's a lot of assertions of what the VTPEIR does or doesn't say about fire regimes. That it's just, I think we didn't do a great job of saying it, perhaps, so that people could understand it, or they didn't read it. I don't really know what the answer is.
Yeah, it's hard to say. You wish to?
Well, I just, we do kind of reference the CFSC. We state pretty clearly up front under the conceptual framework that it's heavily influenced by that.
The framework, the forest chaparral.
That sentence alone kind of underestimates the true influence of that document, because it was kind of used as a roadmap for us for this draft.
That's good.
Okay.
If that document is publicly available, I think referencing it, but making sure that as part of kind of the gray literature that's not in a journal, that it's accessible as a document becomes very important. And that's the power of, having a web where you can post documents where people can find it with a search engine, as opposed to the old era of, I got to grab a copy of this because they're only going to print 200 of them, and if I don't get one now, I'm going to have to photocopy 150 pages to actually have access to this document, right? We can solve that problem for people and make it available. Number 4.
So, I was going to ask Drew to kind of elaborate so you're citing this document. You cited it sounds like what we would maybe like to see is that it's cited, that we received this as a comment. We believed in a lot of its merits, so we incorporated it into this current version. Some you might want to articulate for the reading public. There are some comments in that probably no longer apply.
Because they're too.
Because it was on
very different
comments on a
very
previous
different
version.
So let's just.
I'd ask you to ruminate on that a little bit.
So more of a background on that.
Yeah, maybe
right now
let's double check how it's entered into the document as a reference.
Yeah.
Certainly, our response to comments, we'll have to comment. As I pointed out a couple places where there are references to this in the comments we've received, but I brought that up just to say I think the board has discussed this, and the nature of our response to those comments is fairly evident in the discussion that we've had. But that begs the question of, did we adequately highlight the intellectual influence of that review as we've gone through this process? So let's just double check that. And again, it's one of those things where trying to keep all of this loaded in short-term memory means sometimes we lose places in our mind as to where this is treated. I think there's a place where the history of the evolution of this document is treated in here where that's said, but I'd have to go back and spend time searching for it. And the hard copy, which I prefer, is not the place to do that. I'd need to do that in electronic. I wanted to move on and talk about, there's another place as we're kind of progressing. I'm moving thematically, but also sequentially through these comments. Comment 216 is just another place, Ms. Hannigan, that emphasizes the importance of our dealing with, as Member Husari pointed out earlier, the role of landowners' responsibility under other state programs in terms of responsibility relative to the near space to their home relative to the state-funded activities that this document covers. So that comes in there again. There are several comments, again, about this high-severity wildfire, and for your benefit, 221 is a good one on this issue. But there is another theme that emerges, which is the idea that there is a lack of foundation for the notion that vegetation treatment reduces costs. And so examples of those, there's a variety of them, but 218, 219 are good examples of this sort of, is there a foundation for saying these activities, particularly in the WUI, are cost-effective way to reduce costs? And I thought that might actually be a good one to turn to you on the board and see what kind of direction you feel on there. I mean, there is an underlying presumption here that these treatments have value in the WUI relative to those objectives, especially number one, which the reduce losses to life, property, and natural resources. So, comments?
This is an area, I mean, you heard me go on and on about it earlier.
Yes.
I agree with it. I don't think fuel treatment at this scale reduces suppression costs, but we...
At the 60,000 acres
60,
or in the scope of the program.
Yes.
So
that objective has always bothered me, but remember, we dialed it back and you put some language in.
Yes.
That addresses that. And
yes.
It makes me think that they may not be looking at the current version, because there is language now that
yes.
that says it is reduces suppression costs at the micro level, at the project level, not of the overall state program,
yes.
which is what it used to say.
Right. And so I do feel we've got a response to this. So
I mean, I need to look and see what page that's on, but for Edith, because she's trying to write this down. If we could...
There's a reason I'm recording it. It's okay.
If we can give you the page number, it would be probably...
2728.
It should be under Objective 3, the narrative.
Thanks.
So you don't have to go looking for it yourself.
Always appreciate that.
I'm like, don't mind us in the back here for looking.
And there become a variety of these which deal with cost effectiveness. Those were just the ones that I thought called it out most. So,
and we'll be spending a lot of time responding to that letter.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Which the Center for Biological
Diversity one,
yeah.
But it echoes some comments in other letters. So response to that letter is the model for the response to the others.
Everybody else.
Yeah.
Do we have to respond to cost benefit in a more general way? Does it require cost benefit? I don't remember that.
So,
like under CEQA?
Yeah.
I think this is different than the response we have to do when we're doing public regulatory code.
Right. That's what I was wondering.
And in fact, you can state your objectives, and you should reach your objectives cost effectively. Is basic, good management.
Yeah.
But cost effectiveness is a standard that all government activities are normally held to.
Yeah.
But it's not enshrined, and so. I think it's very interesting that if we get into environmental law, and you've probably worked in this more than I have, there are big sections of things like the ESA, which are explicitly not economic in their orientation, and the same in determination of some of the elements that we're trying to think about public safety here or public health impacts. By reducing particulate loads, and if you look into the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, and what are the bases for setting the standards that we're trying to operate within, or minimize the degree to which we're not in compliance. Those are set based on the vulnerability of, the particularly vulnerable portions of the population. They're not based on cost effectiveness. The idea that you want the same clean air standard in terms of public health, whether you're in Los Angeles or Wyoming, is not based on economics. It's just, you try and achieve your objectives in a cost-effective manner. And so that's one of the reasons that I think the idea that at least we're talking about projects that are cost effective in terms of the overall activities of the agency with respect to its mandate. If you think about suppression costs and the WUI and things like that, I do feel we're responsive to the economic mandate as I understand it in these laws, but I don't know. Anyone else have any feelings on that one?
Well, that speaks more to the program itself, I think.
Yeah.
And the reason for it, rather than the environmental analysis and mitigation, the other CEQA aspects.
Right. It's just there are a number of comments around the cost effectiveness of the
Yes.
program, and I guess I was wondering if we could say explicitly that that's not the goal of the CEQA process. So those comments that on some level those comments aren't appropriate because that's actually not what. That's why I'm asking.
I think it depends on the framework of the question and what language in the document that we write they're responding to.
Right.
But I'll write it down as a potential option.
Yes.
And they may be referring to ecological cost rather than economic cost, and
Right.
sometimes people will kind of mix those two together.
And that's an explicit thing that we do want to think about. So
That's
again,
overall
under
ecosystem
CEQA.
impacts, right?
Yeah, or going back to your thing about cost effectiveness as a general programmatic goal. As if we want to manage these ecosystems, we want to actually have some success. That this is a reasonable approach. But again, it was a way of backing out of too much. I don't want to get into the ridiculous cost-benefit analysis that would be impossible to come up with anything objective. That's what I was trying to avoid. And by saying it's not part of the CEQA process.
Actually coming up, right. So there's a reason fire economics is a very small field. It's very tough. Armando Gonzalez Caban and Haley Heslin, and the number of people that have made that a focus in their career is very small, and partly it's because the data is very, very limited.
I think at the bottom line of this, or the basis of it, is justifying the use of public funds in the public interest. And so what is that interest? If you have a lot of fires, it costs a lot of money to fix it. If you get your house burned down, whether or not somebody in L.A. thinks it's a catastrophe, if you're in Orleans and your house burns down, it's a catastrophe.
Right.
Okay? So to eliminate those problems up front, you do an ounce of prevention with a pound of cure. It's not something original to us in California or, it's been there a long time, okay?
Yeah.
It's really conservative management of the resources, okay? And so I think it would be advisable, if you really want some good language, please read the National Environmental Policy Act and the California Environmental Quality Act and the signing statements of the presidents who put those things into law. There really are really tight language in there. Nixon and Reagan did so much to protect the environment. You look at all the body of work they did, even though they screwed up in a lot of ways, that there's a lot of people in so-called Republicans that are trying to undo those things that were put in place by very conservative Republicans. Right. Okay? So, what is in the public interest at this point? Okay?
So I could also help you if you want. I mean, the statement about cost effectiveness becomes complex in that it's technically you get into sort of stochastic expected loss impact. Right. So the cost effectiveness of any vegetation program is a function of where the fires actually happen and the situations under which they happen. And so that stochastic nature of anything that you go at in fire means that people thinking about conventional cost-benefit analysis, when you're dealing with stochastic phenomena, it becomes more difficult. And when you're dealing with a combination of market and non-market costs and benefits, it becomes even more complex. And so it's economics at its most difficult. And it becomes difficult to portray to decision makers or communities in a really clear way. But I we'll go back and look at that specifically, because there are enough comments about cost effectiveness that, at least from my background as an economist, I thought maybe it would be good for me to weigh in and do a separate review of that for you in the response. And I'm not sure if that would mean some tweaks in here, or whether that's just how you respond when we're preparing the response to public comment for this. We have 1 minute remaining on our agenda, and so I'm going to say, in that now 45 seconds remaining, is there any desire for additional public or agency comment in the room? Anyone online? I think that we can say, given that it is now 4 o'clock officially, that the workshop is adjourned. And thank you all very much for your comments. Thank you.